Guys, this is the first time I've done this in a video because I have filmed my entire video before doing the intro, and I did that because I can happily say now that we have the longest and the most informative video of all time in touchdowns to home runs history. Guys, welcome to the North to South show presented by Touchdowns to Home Runs. Obviously, this is the big video of what a bunch of you guys have been leading up to. I casted a poll because I said I couldn't be doing the live shows this week. I apologize. I'm up north for the week. I cannot do a live show. But I asked, do you guys want me to put my SEC predictions out now? And you guys said, or a majority of you guys said 100% yes, I want them out this week. And that's what you're getting. You guys are getting over an hour of my hard work and information and everything like that for my amazing SEC predictions. So, of course, I appreciate all of you guys for tuning in. If you are not subscribed to Touchdowns to Home Runs, please do me a huge favor and do yourself a huge favor if you love college football, or more importantly, SEC football. Hit that sub button, and everyone hit that like button. And now, let us get on and sit back, relax, and enjoy this basically movie of my SEC predictions. Kicking off my SEC predictions with the 7th team in the SEC East, and coming in at number 7, I have the Vanderbilt Commodores. Now, we all know what's going on with Vanderbilt. They're going through a coaching change, obviously. Clark Lee comes in to be the head man at Vanderbilt after they go 0-9 last season. That is right. The Vanderbilt Commodores did not win a single game last season. Obviously, it was an all-SEC slate. Went 0-9 against the SEC. Vanderbilt this season, I don't like stomping on them. I don't think anyone really likes just stomping on this team because I'm not the guy who's going to be negative about each and every team. Yes, there's certain scenarios that I look at and I might be a bit negative, but I'm not tending to be that guy who's just really negative, really picking on some of the bad teams and really just have some teams that I absolutely hate. Vanderbilt's just in a rough spot. This isn't me coming out here and just talking crap about Vanderbilt and what their program's in right now and everything. You look at what they have if we're actually going to talk some roster status and everything like that this year. Coming in at quarterback, I think the quarterback might actually be your strength if you are Vanderbilt coming into the season, as you have returning starter Ken Seals come back on the scene for Vanderbilt, and then also he matches up with two amazing wide receivers as Cam Johnson comes back, and then you're also going to have Abdur Rahman come back as well. So the leading receivers, or two of the top 3 leading receivers for Vanderbilt last season, are going to be huge in Vanderbilt's success offensively, if they do have any success offensively this season. Now, we look at their stats last season. Obviously, they scored around 15 points per game and gave up around 37 points per game. I just don't know how you look at that and look at the recruiting that Vanderbilt's bringing in this year and all that other stuff and the schedule that they go up against. Even just looking at the schedule, it is not easy for Vanderbilt this season. I think they pulled Mississippi State in the rotating SEC West opponent this season, who might actually be their most beatable opponent out of the SEC this season. You're also going to look at teams like you have to travel to South Carolina. You're going to get Tennessee at home, I'm pretty sure. You have to travel to Colorado State, which I don't think is a guaranteed win at all for them. You have Stanford coming home to Vanderbilt. You have Eastern Tennessee, which I hope should be a win for Vanderbilt. But other than that, it's not that I really want to beat down on this program and everything. I just look at where they're at right now, coaching change and everything like that, the talent standpoint that they're at, and how they performed last season, and I just don't see how you can bump them anywhere else other than 7 in the SEC East standings this season. So right now, I have the Vanderbilt Commodores as my number 7 team in the SEC East. Coming in at my number 7 spot in the SEC West, I have the Mississippi State Bulldogs. Now, before I even get to talking about Mississippi State and really touching on them, I just want to point out this is a dang good 7th ball club. For if we're talking, I'm putting this team last in their division. You put this team in up against any other conference and everything like that, no matter who was going to get the last team in the SEC West, I think this is a pretty good ball club, and I think that all of the programs in the SEC West are in a tremendous spot right now, and that division, man, best in college football, no question about it. But let's talk about Mississippi State and why I have them 7th of all places, when you can make a good argument for them being 6th. I've seen other people make good arguments for them being 5th, but I ultimately have them in 7th. We all know that Mississippi State obviously is an air raid school. That was their main goal, or their main source of picking up yards last season under Mike Leach's first season. He comes into his second season at Mississippi State. The problem is with the air raid and everything like that, this Mississippi State run game was absolutely terrible last season, finishing dead last in the SEC, averaged 43 rushing yards a game. I think when you're in the SEC, you got to be two-dimensional. You got to get yards in multiple different ways. I know the air raid worked the first game, and it was amazing to watch KJ Costello go and throw out, I think it was over 600 yards. It was amazing to watch. The rest of the season, it didn't really work, and I think we saw that even though Mississippi State did finish 5th overall in passing, this team was only scoring around 21 points a game for an air raid offense that was supposed to be absolutely lethal after that first game. And I admit myself, I was guilty because I came out with a video after that LSU game saying, is Mississippi State a playoff contender and all that stuff? Got caught up in the hype. Hand up. I'll admit that I was wrong there. But you look at what they're bringing back this season, you're obviously going to have Will Rogers as your quarterback, who I think has a really good case of being a top 10 quarterback in all the SEC this season. I think he gets some great wide receivers back with him, especially you're looking at Jaden Walley, who was the leading receiver in terms of yards. He caught for over 700 yards last season. You look at Austin Williams, you look at Malik Heath. I think you got a great base of wide receivers for Mississippi State to be successful in the passing game again. And even talking about the rushing game, not so much the rushing game, but more of the pass attack rushing game, where your leading receiver in terms of receptions last season was one of your running backs, and your leading running back, of course, I'm talking about Marks in that case. They just have to be somewhat two-dimensional. I just want to see this team be able to rush the ball more. I'm not saying they have to be in the top half of the SEC. Obviously, this is a team who's definitely set up mostly to pick up most of the yards, at least offensively, in the passing game. We all know that that's their strength. I think Will Rogers is a great quarterback. I think they got the wide receivers room, but you got to pick up more than 43 yards a game. I think that shows, and I think that shows why you were only able to put up 21 points a game last season, because it's just so predictable what you're going to see from Mississippi State each game, week in and week out, and that kind of drove Kylan Hill out of the team last year, which obviously he was one of the better running backs in all the SEC. Didn't really get to see him much last season. We were talking about the Mississippi State Bulldogs defensively now. I think defensively, this team was most successful against the rush last season, finishing 5th in the SEC, but I think you're going to take a huge loss of that. Obviously, losing guys like Jones, losing guys like Spencer, losing guys like Thompson is going to really hurt this Mississippi State Bulldogs defense in terms of the rushing game. The secondary in the passing game was really weak last season, as Mississippi State finished 13th in passing in all the SEC last season. Obviously, that is not going to work, especially in the SEC West, when you still got to go up against Alabama each and every season. You got to go up against Texas A&M. You got to go up against Ole Miss, your in-state rival. You got to go up against LSU. Your passing game has to be a lot better if you want to be successful in the SEC. So for those reasons, I know there are a couple other programs that especially Mississippi State fans are probably like, hey, we could compete with this team. I don't know why you had this team, our Bulldogs in 7th or whatever, but that's where I have Mississippi State right now. I have them as the 7th best team in the SEC West. I just think that they need to become more diverse in terms of scoring and picking up yards and everything like that. And you really got to tighten up that passing defensively, because the Bulldogs were thrown on a lot last season, and they definitely got to get better than that. But hey, Mississippi State, Oma Dogs, they won the national championship in baseball. Can't be complaining with that. I bet you a lot of Mississippi State fans would trade a football season, a bad football season, for a baseball national championship. Their first national championship out of all sports for Mississippi State. So congrats there. But for now, I have the Mississippi State Bulldogs as my 7th team in the SEC West. Coming in now at my number 6 spot, I have my beloved South Carolina Gamecocks. Now, another thing that I want to point out, just give a heads up for all of you Gamecock fans or any fan of this channel, the Gamecocks content will be coming to an end coming soon, or this might actually be the last time me talking about the Gamecocks on this channel, so I will explain later why. I just wanted to give you a heads up. If you start to notice that I start talking about the Gamecocks less, just wanted to give a heads up. I will give the explanation later. But for now, talking about why I have this Gamecocks team as my number 6 team in the SEC East. This 6th ranking, first of all, I want to say, does not take away a single thing, not a single thing, from the amazing job that Shane Beamer, and not just Shane Beamer, but the staff that he has hired at South Carolina has done up to this point for South Carolina football. Going back to December 5th, the day that all of this came, I think he got officially hired the 6th or the 5th. It depends on what time of day he got officially hired. But looking at that point, looking at the position that our program was in, and everything from him going out in the transfer portal, hitting the transfer portal enormously this season. I tell you, you look at some of the guys that you're going to see that the Gamecocks pulled from this transfer portal. You as an average SEC fan, if you're not a big Gamecocks fan, these are guys that by the end of the season, you will know their names. I tell you that. Looking at the guys that the Gamecocks have been able to pull in recruiting-wise, the amazing job that Shane Beamer and his recruiting staff have been able to do in pulling in big recruits. And let me tell you, it is not ending there. The Gamecocks are, 16th in the 24/7 composite right now in recruiting for 2022. You look at the point that the Gamecocks were in 2021, the dead last in the SEC. So the massive jump that Shane Beamer has made already in recruiting, and that's not even a full class yet, because I tell you, there's still lots of more great recruits to come to the South Carolina football program. Astronomical. And I think even looking at this program's culture and everything, just from what we're seeing, we're about to hear from SEC Media Days, cannot wait for that. But just looking at this program as a whole, this 6th ranking that I'm putting them in, even as a huge Gamecocks fan, does not take away a single thing from the improvement that has been built on our program already. So why have I put my favorite team at number 6? If anything, shouldn't I be more biased towards my team? Shouldn't I have this team at least 5th? Shouldn't I put this team over teams like Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, all this kind of stuff? Now, there's definitely optimism for me in this program. There's optimism for everyone in this program for the next coming years for Shane Beamer, but there's also realistic optimism. The realistic optimism, or the realistic with this team, is we not only play one of the toughest schedules year in and year out in the SEC, but in all of college football. And it hasn't changed. It hasn't changed for the last 5 years that the Gamecocks are always going to play an absolutely loaded slate each and every season. You look at the last 2 seasons, you know our combined win total, 6. That's within 2 seasons. We have to combine 2 seasons together. Yes, you could talk about COVID last year. You could talk about, we played an all SEC slate. Still went 2-8. Still not what you want to do as a football program. You want to be at least at that 500 mark if you are wanting to be a respected college football program. The Gamecocks still have a lot of work to be done. Lots of things to be done. And as much as I want to talk about, and as much as you probably as a Gamecocks fan, if you are one of these people who will say I have a kind of loser's mentality right now in the fact that record almost comes second to me this season. Record almost comes second to me this season as much as I want to win. Look, when we get 2-3 years down the road, I want to win some football games. But I look at this year, there are smaller wins that do not count in the win category that I could see picked up by Shane Beamer and his staff this season that, for me at least, will have me very, very excited. I think it will have recruits catching eyes and looking at what's being built at South Carolina, stuff like that. For instance, talking about, let's say, how this Gamecock team responds from going to Georgia, a 7 o'clock night game, week 3 of the college football season, how they respond against going up to a really, really good Georgia program and coming back home to play Kentucky. How is the Gamecocks able to play in that game? Another thing, how is this offense being able to travel on the road and everything like that? We got a new OC, Marcus Satterfield, coming in this season. How is he going to do with traveling this offense? Because it's hard to travel for our offense. We know that we're a bit better at home, but still, traveling on the road, I think, is a huge point of emphasis that the Gamecocks need to focus on this season. Another one. Let's say the Gamecocks go out this season. We go to College Station. We go to Texas A&M and against any sizable opponent. I figure it out as a win, or I see it as a win, if the Gamecocks are able to go into the fourth quarter as in a 1-score game and maybe even lose by 10 points or less than double digits. So anywhere from 9-0. Even if we lose that game, guys, that is still progress from what we've seen the last 2 years against Texas A&M. If we get a close game against Clemson at home, anything like that, it's not really, I'm looking for, we have to go out this season. We have to beat Texas A&M. We have to beat Georgia. We have to beat your Missouris, your Kentuckys. We have to do this, that, and that. All I want to see is competitiveness and just really showing improvement in terms of how competitive this program can be with the rest of the SEC East and really the rest of the SEC this season, because you kind of saw that slip off after the Auburn game last season, obviously we go out, we beat Vanderbilt, and we beat Auburn after that. After that, you lose to LSU, you lose to Texas A&M, you give up 59 points to Ole Miss. Missouri was probably our closest game. After that point, we only lost by 7, and then you get beat pretty good by Georgia and then Kentucky, which obviously our program, there's lots of problems in the roster and everything like that, but we got beat by pretty sizable margins. Losing, I almost want to see how we lose or see improvement of how we lose rather than go out and just make a bowl this season. Trust me, making a bowl, I would love to see it. All of Gamecock Nation would be absolutely ecstatic if we see a bowl this season. But what I'm trying to say is if this team only goes out and wins 5 games this season, or 4 games this season, do not be upset, because there are multiple other things where you could find rooms of improvement and see this Gamecock program really progress under Shane Beamer's first season other than the record. That's all I'm saying. So now let me actually talk about the team and not just talk about why this Gamecocks team. You can find other points that play a hard schedule and all that stuff I just ran through. The Gamecocks offense this season, we'll start off with the offense. We know the strength of this offense. Talk about a guy named Kevin Harris, SEC leading rusher, obviously one of the top guys in all of college football at the running back position. Actually has some pretty decent odds on winning the Heisman this season. Now, it might be a bit of a long shot for some of you, but it's up there. If he's able to produce like we all think he can produce, he could be in that conversation. And then not only do you have Ken Harris in this backfield this season, talk about a guy named Marshawn Lloyd coming in, 4-star athlete, depending on where you get your recruiting. I always go off 24/7, but I know on spots like Rivals, he was a 5-star and everything like that. Marshawn Lloyd coming in, the praise and everything that this guy has gotten up to the point where he hasn't even stepped foot on Williams-Brice Stadium grass. The praise that he is getting and what we all think he is capable of is through the roof. We've seen this guy's high school tapes. We've seen him in practice at South Carolina and what he's been able to do. Really excited to see what we do there. But don't forget about the other guys under him. Look at Zaquandre White. I think he could have a big season. You look at Rashad Amos. You look at guys like Caleb McDowell. I think the running back group, obviously a huge strength for the Gamecocks this season. I look at the O-linemen. I think we return 4 or 5 starters, something like that. We obviously lose Darius Hutcherson last season, but we still got a lot of the guys that we had last year. So I think O-line-wise, we're going to have just as much success. If not, we should have even more success in the rushing game than we did last season. The passing game is really where Marcus Satterfield, we're going to see how he steps up as a coach, and you're going to look at Coach Stepp and obviously like that, working with the wide receivers, and how progressive is this Gamecocks passing offense going to be. It's not going to be the strength of this offense. I think we all know that. It's not going to be where we pick up majority of our yards, but I think in the games where you're looking at a 50-50 coin toss, that kind of stuff, the Gamecocks passing game has to be relevant and has to be good enough to be able to come out with the wins of those games. We obviously have Luke Doty at quarterback this season. Look, no matter what the national narrative, no matter what people are saying outside of Gamecock fans and stuff like that, Luke Doty is a really, really athletic, and he has really, really good upside to this team. Yes, there could be stuff to be worked on with the arm. We know the deep ball has come a bit shaky in his freshman year, but let's be honest, he only played 3 games. He only got little experience in the SEC. So this is basically, if you want to call it, his freshman season. He entered in at Gamecock football in kind of a poor time in our program. Let's call this his freshman season. Even though it's a second season, let's call it a freshman season for him, but we know what he's capable of on the ground, and if he can really work on his arm, the Gamecocks know what they have in Luke Doty for the next coming years. You look at the wide receiver room. You look at some of the guys that the Gamecocks have had prior, but I really want to put an emphasis on the guys that we have landed in the transfer portal. Obviously, E.J. Jenkins, we could talk about him as a tight end, or we could talk about him as a wide receiver. I honestly think he's a tight end, but a lot of people say wide receivers, so I'll throw him in the wide receivers. E.J. Jenkins, obviously 6'7", monster of an athlete that we're going to have catching balls from Luke Doty this season. Look for him. Look like another guy, Amarian Brown. A guy who's got some real speed, a guy that we go out and grab from Georgia Tech. Look for him to be one of the Gamecocks' big wide receivers, and a guy that I'm really excited to see step back onto the stage this season, a guy named Ortre Smith. You go back to 2017, obviously had a huge freshman campaign. Injuries and everything like that has affected him since, but if we get him back fully and healthy and he can show us and finish off what he did in 2017, come back and have a really good 2021, I think the passing game for the Gamecocks will be improved again. Satterfield, excited to see what he can do on this offense. Now, the defense, we kind of know what it is. Clayton White coming in on the DC. We are strong up front. We have an amazing defensive line. There's a bunch of guys that you could name off, from Zach Pickens to Jordan Birch. You can Kinsley Enagbari, obviously SEC sack leaders. There's so many different guys that we could talk about there. That Jabari Ellis, another guy. Jordan Strachan, the guy that we grabbed in the transfer portal. Again, another guy that Shane Beamer was able to go out and grab. Tons of talent coming to this defensive line. We know that's our strength. You look at the linebacking core, I still think there's tons of great guys. You're going to have guys like Muhammad Kaba. You're going to have guys like Debo Williams. You're going to have guys like Sherrod Green. I think this linebacker core, I wouldn't say it's the weakness of this defense. I wouldn't say it's the strength of this defense either. Again, I've stated it already. This D-line is what I'm really, really most excited for. The DBs is what is going to kind of be our main point of concern this season, and that was even with some great guys that we had last year. The DC, obviously Clayton White, is going to be tested huge with this secondary and how he's going to be able to put them in a point of success for us to be successful defensively next season. That was kind of our problem last year. You look at the guys that we had in their secondary. J.C. Horn, first defensive player off the board in the whole NFL draft. You look at a guy in Israel Mukwamo who was 6th round pick to the Dallas Cowboys, is now going to go play safety over there for them. We had tons of talent in our secondary that we just weren't, for some reason, we just weren't able to play good. And I still think we got tons of talent. Another guy that I could go out and name from the transfer portal that the Gamecocks just got, Karan Prunty. Cornerback, was all-American freshman last year for Kansas. You got Cam Smith still. You still got tons of talent. RJ Roderick coming back. Tons of talent in the secondary. And the secondary, yes, it was our weakness last year. We gave up a lot of yards in the passing game. You look especially at Ole Miss. That was a really, really rough game for us against a good passing offense, which we're going to see tons of good passing offenses this season. So, as a whole, the Gamecocks, I really like the spot they're in. Even though I had them at 6, even though I have them towards the bottom of the whole SEC and the SEC East, there's still lots to be optimistic about. It's just all comes down to the Gamecocks play a really, really, really tough schedule this season. The Gamecocks, they're going up against teams like, if we want to move up, it's honestly going to come down to, can this team pull out 2 wins in the SEC, or can this team come out with 3 wins in the SEC? And what it came down to me was, I think this team can easily pick up 2 wins in the SEC. That third one, competing with the team I have at number 5 in the SEC East, I think that game between those 2 teams will be absolutely key. And the one thing that really just determined it for me, putting South Carolina at 6 and this other team at 5, is that we go to a place, the other team gets that game at home, and we go to a place that the Gamecocks have struggled really, really badly in the past. And going through my picks the last season and everything like that, stuff I've learned is just, when you are uncertain about games to this point, pick the home team. It's probably going to be the home team. So other than that, I'm really optimistic about the Gamecocks. I'm really optimistic about Shane Beamer. Again, this staff has already done an amazing job, but for right now, until I see this team hit the field, I have them predicted as my number 6 team in the SEC East this season. At my number 6 spot in the SEC West, I have the Auburn Tigers. Now, obviously, Auburn fans, I don't expect them to like this pick at all. I don't expect anyone to think Auburn should be higher this season to like this pick, but it's my overall pick, and I don't bullcrap any of these. I don't just throw teams at the bottom to get a reaction from you guys and all this other stuff. These are all predictions that I truly believe in, and I'm going to tell you guys why I have Auburn at my number 6 spot. Obviously, coming in this season, they come in through a coaching change, which multiple SEC teams are going through this season, and if you've been able to tell from what you've seen already through this is the 4th team I've talked about already. We have already seen 3 teams with a new coach at the bottom of these rankings already. So this is nothing new. This is nothing new for these new SEC coaches and everything like that. But I just had them all towards the bottom, and I'm going to tell you why I have Auburn towards the bottom right now. So I want to talk about, first off, the positive that I see with Auburn, and 110%, because this Auburn defense, when you talk about SEC defenses, when you talk about the elite ones and everything like that, you're obviously going to touch on Alabama this season. You're obviously going to touch on Georgia this season. You might touch on LSU, maybe even Florida. I've heard a lot of people talking really good about Florida's defense as well. No one seems to talk about how good this Auburn defense, first of all, was last season, and how good they are going to be this season. I think you have a very, very dangerous defense in Auburn that a lot of teams aren't going to be, or I wouldn't say a lot of teams aren't expecting, but a lot of fan bases of teams aren't expecting. A lot of fan bases of opposing teams aren't expecting going up against Auburn. First of all, this team finished 4th in the SEC in total scoring on defense. They only allowed around 25 points per game. Passing wise, in the passing game, I think the secondary is definitely one of the better ones in all of college football. You look at a guy in Smoke Monday, of course, coming back. You look at a guy like Pritchett coming back. You look at a guy named McCreary coming back. Lots of talent returning in the secondary for Auburn. I think the linebacking core, as highly as I think of that secondary, and I do think that that is the bread and butter for this Auburn team, especially defensively. I think the linebackers especially hold their own as well. You look at a guy like Owen Pappa, you look at a guy like Zacoby McClain. I'm really, really, really excited to see how this Auburn defense performs and see if they can pick up where they left off last season, because this was definitely one of the more underrated defenses that we saw in all the SEC last season, and really excited to see what they can get into this season. And I think the D-line is going to be fine. The D-line is, I wouldn't say they're a weakness of this team. I wouldn't say they're holding this defense back, but I just really look at that linebacking core and I look at this secondary. And if I was an Auburn fan, I'd be really, really, really excited to see what we had defensively this season. Going on to the offense, and this is where I feel like many of my concerns comes in, because we come into this new day and age of college football where offense means a lot more to the record than defense. I think offense means more in the regular season, 110%. You could argue defense means more when you get into the playoffs and everything like that, because you can't just be a team like, for example, Ole Miss. You can't just have a lethal offense all season and going up against weak defenses, and then you get to the playoff. Once you actually play a defense, your defense is going to have to be able to stop the ball at some points. But enough about that. Now talking about Auburn's offense, and what I'm really emphasizing is the production of this offense. This team finished 9th in all scoring offense in the SEC last season, only putting up around 25 points a game. And my main point of concern, let's go through what I think about the players and everything like that. Obviously, I look at this running back room. That's probably the strength of this team. I think a lot of people would agree it's the strength of this team. You look at Tank Bigsby, you look at Sean Shivers. I've mentioned them a ton of times on this channel. There's a ton of things that you could talk good about all of them, but I just feel like I've repeated myself constantly about Tank Bigsby being one of the breakout freshmen last season. I think Sean Shivers is an amazing running back too. I'm really, really, really liking that running back room this year. Even the wide receiver room. I mean, I just put out a segment on talking about Demetrius Robertson transferring to Auburn. I think he is going to help out that wide receiver room a lot more than a lot of people think he is, because I think he is a clear-cut wide receiver one for Auburn this season, which is really going to help out the guy passing the ball to him in Bo Nix. Bo Nix is my big question mark for this team. Lots of people have many, many, many different opinions on Bo Nix. I think he's inconsistent. I think him playing at Jordan-Hare is a lot easier for him. I think he's proven that he's a lot better playing at Jordan-Hare. I mean, take a look at a game last season. You obviously look at the LSU game. Definitely one of his better games of all last season. As a whole, one of Auburn's best games all season last year. And then you take a game like South Carolina where he just throws 3 picks. And I think another problem for this team, not really talking about Bo Nix, going off on a tangent for a bit, was putting the ball on the floor. There's lots of turnovers lost for Auburn this season. Lots of fumbles lost for this season for Auburn, which is definitely going to be need to be cleaned up. But the quarterbacks, right now, Bo Nix is the guy. I still see him as the guy, and until I see anything hit the field, I still feel confident that he is going to be the guy. I've kind of put out in previous videos talking about how week 3 is kind of my point where if it's really, really rough for Bo Nix, I think he's going to be yanked in week 3, and then you obviously turn it to TJ Finley or Demetrius Davis. But I think Bo Nix is going to be the big question mark for me this season, at least, and this O-line as well. Even though the O-line returns 5 of 5 starters, there's just something about this O-line, the way they gelled last season. It was a huge liability for Auburn and a huge point of concern upon a bunch of their fans last season. So I look at the passing game, obviously with the quarterback, whoever you're going to throw in there, because this was the 10th best passing game in all the SEC last season, only putting up around 220 yards per game in the air last season for Auburn. And I'm just worried about this O-line, especially scoring on the road. This whole team as a whole scoring on the road. I brought on some of my friends, good friends of the channel, amazing content creators. Let me tell you guys, if you're an Auburn fan, you already know them, but the War Report, even if you're an opposing fan, like they haven't even told me to do this. They just do such an amazing job, and I've been following them recently, that you definitely got to go check them out. I had them on the show and we talked a bit. We broke down Auburn's schedule, and one of their main points of concerns that if anything was going to go wrong for this Auburn team this year, was those road games and being able to score on the road. This team only put up, if you count, I'm counting in this case the Northwestern game, games outside of Jordan-Hare Stadium, the comfort of Jordan-Hare Stadium for Auburn. This offense was only able to put up around 19 points per game, which is obviously not a spot you want to be. If you can't put up over 20 points a game on the road in the SEC, it's going to be really, really tough to have a successful season. Obviously, that's going to have to pick up this season. And if I ask Auburn fans, what are your big games of this season? Obviously, your brain right away switches to the Iron Bowl, which is at home at Auburn, Jordan-Hare Stadium, and the big Georgia game at home, of course. I look at some of the big games this season for Auburn in terms of being able to boost this SEC record. The road games especially. We're not going to talk about the Penn State game because this is SEC predictions. That Penn State game has no reflection on what happens in the SEC standings. Like, Auburn could go out, lose all their non-conference games, and still go undefeated in the SEC and go to the SEC championship. That game means nothing. But I look at the road games that they have in the SEC this season. A game like going to Arkansas, a game that was really, really, really close last season, very controversial game. How is Auburn going to be able to travel to Arkansas? A team that I'm really high on this year, a team that I think a lot of people are going to underestimate this season. Going to a place like South Carolina, again, you lost the game last year. I don't really want to bring up last year. I know I bring up a lot of stats from last year, especially when you have a lot of returning experience like Auburn does going into this season. But last season, 2 new coaches are coming in, but we could talk about Bo Nix struggled in South Carolina, threw 3 picks in that game. It was tough for him that game. Who else do they play on the road? You play LSU on the road. You have to go to Death Valley next season, a game that you won last season, obviously in the home comfort of Jordan-Hare Stadium. You have to go to Death Valley, which is never going to be easy. You have to go to Texas A&M this season. Look, I think that they're going to beat Mississippi State this season, but I look at all the other SEC games for this Auburn team. Ole Miss, I think, is going to be a really tough game. It definitely could be a game that they pull out with, but they get the game at home, which I think is good for them. I personally think Alabama and Georgia are going to be a bit out of reach this season. Not saying it's impossible, but those are 2 really, really good teams. The rest of the games that I feel like make up majority of this SEC record for Auburn kind of scare me. I think that they could definitely beat South Carolina. I'm not coming out here and saying that my Gamecocks are better than Auburn. I'm not coming out here and saying that Auburn is better than my Gamecocks, but that could be a winnable game for both teams easily. I think it's good South Carolina gets it at home, and I think that Auburn's a very competitive team who could obviously go out and win that game, and I wouldn't be shocked. I look at LSU and Texas A&M. Obviously, going there is going to be really, really tough. And finally, what really put it over the edge for me is going to Arkansas. That game, I honestly feel, could be as easily as a loss for Auburn as it could be easily as a loss for Arkansas. For Auburn fans who think that Arkansas still is a cakewalk game, I hate to break it to you, but Arkansas is in a better spot now than they were 2-3 years ago whenever they were losing all their SEC games. They were barely winning any conference games, losing to teams like Colorado State, stuff like that. That's the old Arkansas team. And what it really comes down to is you still got to pay attention and you still got to realize what I have with my Gamecocks and what has happened with Vanderbilt and what's going to happen at Tennessee as well is you're going to a coaching change. Things are going to take time for this team to really get a feel for what their identity is and everything like that. It is going to take time to this point. So not saying I feel like Auburn has an amazing future up ahead with Brian Harsin at the helm, but for now, I have Auburn at the number 6 spot just because I feel like the road slate in the SEC is going to be a struggle this season. And there are just some other teams in the SEC West, if I'm being honest right now, that I feel more confident in than Auburn in Brian Harsin's first season. Coming in at my number 5 spot in the SEC East, I have the Tennessee Volunteers. Now, I just got all the new head coaches out of the way in the SEC, and I think what all teams with the new head coach this season, as good and talented of players you might have on your team, I think it's really good to just realize that things are going to take time. You're not going to hit it straight off the bat in your first season. I think that's the case for many and all of the SEC teams getting first-year head coaches this season. Now, let's talk about Tennessee because I just put out a video about a week ago, I want to say something like that, talking about how I think Tennessee is underrated in the fact that people are really trashing this team. People are really throwing this team into the dirt, saying that they're going to be a 3-win team this season, that this team is going to miss a bowl game easily, that they're going to be trashed, that they're going to lose to Vandy this season, all this kind of stuff. And I just said in that video, basically, if you take some of the talent that you have on both sides of the ball in this team, you're actually going to find that this team isn't half bad. And it all depends on how Josh Heupel and his staff are going to be able to come into Tennessee and perform there. But overall, I don't think this Tennessee team is going to do half bad. Now, if you go back to my South Carolina segment when I was talking about them, putting them at 6, and I was talking about it was really, really tough for me to decide between them and the number 5 team. I ultimately gave it to Tennessee because they do get that South Carolina game at home, which I feel like is going to be the deciding factor between the 5 and 6 spot. South Carolina historically has really struggled at Neyland Stadium. It's been a really, really tough place to play, and Tennessee's just had our number when we do play in Tennessee. So I think, first of all, before even talking about roster and everything like that, this schedule plays out really, really well for Tennessee this season in the sense that they get the games that probably keep them from making a bowl or making it to a bowl at home. Like, I look at the big games, like Pitt is going to be a big one. First of all, you got a big out-of-conference game who Pitt, let's be honest, they can hold their own. They're not a bad football team out of the ACC this season. Of course, I've already done my preview on that. I said I have Tennessee winning that game currently, but do not be surprised at all if Pitt is able to go out there and put on a show and put on a scare for Tennessee, because just as easily as Tennessee could win, just as easily Pitt could win in that game, 110%. Don't forget about that. I think the South Carolina game is going to be huge in determining that. I think even getting a game like Ole Miss at home, a team that is very good offensively, obviously, in Ole Miss, but they are beatable. They're a beatable team. That defense isn't as strong as some of the other defenses that you're going to see in the SEC, so getting a game like that at home is huge. You get South Alabama at home, you get Vandy at home, and then the other 2 games that probably keep you get Tennessee Tech from at home as well. I forgot to add that one in there, and Bowling Green as well. But other 2 teams, if you really wanted to look for a bowl, let's say you drop one of those games, let's say you drop the Pitt, you drop the Ole Miss, something like that, you drop to South Carolina, you're probably going to have to go on the road and beat either Kentucky or Mizzou. So I think the schedule actually plays out pretty favorably for Tennessee, which is another reason why I put them above of South Carolina, because South Carolina plays a really tough schedule. I'm not saying that Tennessee doesn't, because this team does have to play Georgia and Alabama in the same season, but home favorability, I think, really, really helped Tennessee this season. Now, talking about some of the guys on this team and what I really like out of them. Passing game, there's tons of different quarterbacks that you could choose. There's tons of talented quarterbacks on this roster that you could choose from. Hendon Hooker, Harrison Bailey, Joe Milton has a good shot. I think Brian Maurer is also in there. So I think the passing game, I can't remember when I did my SEC quarterback rankings where I put Tennessee's quarterback, because I didn't name a specific guy. I said Tennessee QB, but it was definitely a lot higher than a lot of people are talking. I think I still have Harrison Bailey as the guy for Tennessee, but I could just as easily see Hendon Hooker if you want to go for a dual threat offense for Tennessee in your first season with Josh Heupel. Looking at this rushing game as well, I think that the rushing game, even though you do lose guys like Eric Gray, you lose a guy like Ty Chandler, Jabari Small is a guy that I think could have a really big season out for Tennessee this season. And I look at the wide receivers. Wide receivers ain't bad at all. You look at a guy like Jalen Hyatt, who I think is going to have a breakout year this season. You look at a guy like Velus Jones Jr. this season for Tennessee. Overall, defensively this season, a lot of people are really high on this Tennessee D-line. I think the secondary took a bunch of hits last season, although they do return a couple starters. You're obviously losing a guy like Bryce Thompson, which I think is going to be the biggest hit to this defense, and a guy like Henry To'oTo'o, completely forgot about him. He's probably the biggest hit to this defense because he transferred to Alabama. Transfers killed this team. As much as we want to talk about that, Tennessee's got to go out and put someone out there, and the guys that they do have, the guys that Tennessee always will have talent. You're not going out and having some random D3 guys playing for Tennessee. It just doesn't happen. So you're going to have somewhat talent for this Tennessee team. What really does it for me, why I'm putting them at 5, new head coach. Tennessee's gone through a lot of things the last couple of years. They lost a bunch of guys, even though I just said they have talent on this team. I look at the teams above them. Obviously, the teams that you're going to pick above them is, I have Missouri, Kentucky, Florida, and Georgia right now, all above them in no specific order. Those teams right now, I just feel like there is a gap between 4 and 5 right now. The bottom 3 in the SEC East are kind of all bunched together. I think 5 and 6 are closer than 6 and 7, but that gap between 5 and 4 right now in the SEC East is just too big. So even though I think Tennessee has a good shot at making a bowl this season, have a good shot at turning a 3 SEC win season this season, having them over a Kentucky, a Missouri, a Florida, or a Georgia this season in their first season, I think is a bit overdoing it. So I think I have this Tennessee team placed perfectly here at number 5 in the SEC East. Coming up at my number 5 spot in the SEC West, I have the Arkansas Razorbacks. Now, for you who don't... Coming up at my number 5 spot in the SEC West, I have the Arkansas Razorbacks. Now, this is going to be, quote-unquote, my shock pick for some of you, but honestly, this isn't a shock pick for me. This isn't something that I just do for shock value. This is actually how I feel about this Arkansas team, because this is a team that is being criminally underrated this season, and I believe it's because a lot of fans from opposing teams, like your Auburn fans, other teams in the SEC West, Mississippi State, Ole Miss, LSU, Texas A&M, Alabama, even other SEC teams over in the East and stuff like that. When you see Arkansas's logo on your helmet schedule, most of you, I'd like to bet most of you, or I would bet most of you, a pretty handsome amount too, would chalk that down as a win, because you see that hug on that helmet and you just automatically think, oh, that was the team that only won 2 games in 2018 and 2019. And even so, you look at the record from last season. They only won 3 games last season. Why does that mean anything? Why should I think Arkansas is going to be what of a competitive team in the SEC West this season? I think you're wrong. I think this Arkansas team is going to prove to a lot of people first of all, what Sam Pittman is cooking up at Arkansas and what this team is all about talent-wise, because there are some names in here that you talk about some of the best players at each position group in the SEC. You're not going to talk about these guys. First of all, let's get into the roster now. First of all, talking about linebackers in the SEC, talking about some of the best linebacker units and everything like that. Obviously, Alabama's going to come to your mind. Georgia's going to come to your mind. I just talked about Auburn. Auburn has, even though I was talking about how they're not being talked about enough, I think they're still being talked way more than they are about Arkansas's linebackers. Auburn's going to be good. Florida's going to be good. Georgia, obviously. There's tons of good teams that are talked about constantly just because they're big brand names. But do the names Bumper Pool and Grant Morgan mean anything to you in the fact that you talk about some of the best linebackers? Do those names pop into your head if you're just a general SEC fan outside of being Arkansas fans? Again, I'd like to bet majority of you don't think of those 2 names, although they are definitely guys who are worthy of being talked about in those top unit groups in the linebackers. If I talk about top safeties in all of the SEC, who comes to your head? Probably guys like Smoke Monday, probably a guy like Jordan Battle, guys like that. Jalen Catalon, does that name mean anything to you? Again, I'm just naming off guys who are some of the most talented guys in the SEC at their own perspective or respective positions that just aren't talked about enough at the in Arkansas's defense, and I'll get into their offense later. But first of all, talk about this defense. It would be hypocritical for me not to point out that they did give up 35 points per game last season and go out and use all these stats kind of for the prior teams to prove my case why they're going to be so low. But this Arkansas defense, as good as I talked about them so far, they did give up 35 points this season. Now, you return 9 of 11 starters to this defense this season, and I think if you give Barry Odom a full offseason, that is right, a full offseason, a COVID list, quote-unquote COVID list, because obviously COVID's still in the world, but it has got a lot better since last offseason, if that's what you want to call it, where you kind of had to throw together what you could in the couple months, the couple practices that you had before you had to hit the field against Georgia week 1 for Arkansas. But first of all, thank you for responders and for frontline workers for getting us into the position where we are with COVID. But I think this Arkansas defense still has a lot to show from what last season was. There's still a lot to prove, because I look at 35 points a game. Yeah, I think that they're not going to get it below 20 this season, but they're definitely somewhere better than 35. I think this defense still has a lot to prove this season for what they can show. I talk about this offense. Again, the offense is something that is going to be criminally underrated, because this offense returns all 5 of its offensive linemen in a very successful rushing game last season that not a lot of people talking about, because Rakeem Boyd, as soon as he left, it was kind of like, oh, who does Arkansas even have back there? Traylon Smith rushed for over 700 yards last season. He was not only a serious guy in the rushing game, but also the receiving game, as he had a huge impact in catching the passes for Arkansas last season out of the backfield. And I talk about, again, some of the best pass catchers in all the SEC. I call pass catchers who are the best in the SEC. You tell me John Mechie. You tell me Keishon Butte. You tell me George Pickens, if you want to count him with injury and everything like that. You name all these other guys, and a guy named Treylon Burks is obviously not going to be that name that is going to pop into your head straight away, but he is up there. He is a guy who caught for over, 800 yards last season, caught for 820 yards last season, yet no one talks about this guy. This guy is super high up on a bunch of people's preseason all SEC teams, whatever you want to call it, what all the expert lists come out with, yet no one still respects Treylon Burks as a receiver. KJ Jefferson is going to come in at quarterback this season for Arkansas. Got a bit of playing time last season, threw for 3 touchdowns, hasn't thrown an interception yet. The completion percentage was around 50%. Still a lot of work to be done for him, but I think KJ definitely has the tools and everything around him to be really successful this season. You have a lot returning from what you had last season for Arkansas, a season that, yes, you went 3-7. Sam Pittman, so what? You go 3 wins in your first season. Why is that such a big accomplishment? From a team going in 2019, 2018, only winning 2 games per season to winning 3 SEC games. This weren't just games against your Arkansas Pine Bluffs, your teams like you could pick any FCS team, you can pick any Division II school, whatever you want. Those aren't games against those teams. This is an Arkansas team who, yes, went out and beat SEC opponents. And you can maybe even make an argument that they went 4-6 last season, depending on how you feel about that Auburn game. But this Arkansas team is improving, and I feel like the returning experience this season and how their schedule shapes out, because I haven't even talked about that. If you want to make a bowl game for Arkansas this season, I think all 6 of those winnable games that you have are at home, which is going to be absolutely huge for Arkansas this season. You kick off the season versus Rice, I'm pretty sure. Then week 3 after, you have Texas at home. You get Georgia Southern at home, which is 2 wins there if you count all these as wins, or these are my winnable games. Then you also get your big games. You have Mississippi State at home this season. You have Auburn at home this season. You have Missouri at home this season, and you have Arkansas Pine Bluff at home this season. Those are my 6 most winnable games for Arkansas, most likely this season, and they get all of them at home. I think that is going to be a huge difference maker. Getting DWR in full capacity, you're going to have this crowd ready. You're going to have this Arkansas team really, really hyped up. This is not a team that is to be overlooked this season. I tell you, this Arkansas Razorback team, they have the schedule. They have one of the best schedules in terms of being one of these bottom tier teams, I want to call, in the SEC divisions, in terms of I'm counting them 5 and under, teams that I've ranked 5 and under. They have one of the better schedules to be able to make a bowl game. Feeling really good about Arkansas this season, offensively, defensively, give them a full offseason, and I think this Arkansas team is going to come out. If they don't make a bowl game this season, they're going to play competitive games, I tell you that. So Arkansas is my 5th team in the SEC West. Coming in at my number 4 spot in the SEC East, I have the Kentucky Wildcats. Now, Kentucky last season went 4-6 in the SEC. They went 5-6 in total, and I think they were the perfect example of the team that just beat the teams that they were supposed to beat and lost to the teams that they were supposed to lose to. Now, Kentucky last season picked up a win against Tennessee. They picked up a win against Mississippi State. They picked up a win against Vanderbilt and South Carolina, and they even picked up a big bowl win against a pretty good NC State team that not a lot of people talk about from last season. But they lost to the teams that they were supposed to lose to. I mean, what else can we say? They had to play your Alabamas. They just got that game thrown in. They had to play Auburn this season. They still had to play Florida, Georgia, Missouri, who still was decent last season. There's lots of good and talented teams that they had to play from last season. So don't really beat yourself up too much on Kentucky just because they did have, in the end, a losing record. This is still a pretty good football team. So let's talk about Kentucky going into this season, especially, let's talk defensively first, because people don't talk about Kentucky's defense enough. Again, it seems like this whole video is just talking about, or so far in this video, I've just been talking about underrated defenses, whether it's been Auburn, whether it's been, I guess, my South Carolina Gamecocks. Arkansas I was really high on. Kentucky, if I were to ask you who was the number 1 team against the pass last season in the SEC, would you have guessed Kentucky? And if you did, you were correct, because Kentucky was the best team against the pass last season in all of the SEC. There was a lot of other good things for Kentucky. They finished 5th in total defense and scoring defense. They only allowed around 26 points per game. This Kentucky defense over the years has been really solid. People just don't talk about them because they are Kentucky all in all, and they aren't one of those big programs that jump out in football. Basketball, different scenario, but football isn't one of those schools. Kentucky isn't one of those schools that really jump out at you. And I expect, yes, there was some turnover. You obviously lose like Jamin Davis, but this defense, do not forget about how good they were last season. I'm looking guys like Corker. I'm looking guys like Pascal to be the big guys on this defense, really step up and make this Kentucky defense successful. Offensively, I think this offense is really good, or underrated. Again, I use the word again, underrated, except for one spot, and that one spot is kind of a killer, but we're going to talk about that in a bit. Let's start off with this O-line. This O-line is going to be one of the better ones in all the SEC. I talked about Kinnard before when I was talking about doing my fantasy position draft, which if you haven't seen that video, you should definitely go check it out because it is an amazing video. Talking about Kinnard, I talked about this whole offensive line as a whole and how they really performed last year and how they're going to perform this year. I think Kentucky is going to have an amazing offensive line this year. You look at the running back room, obviously Chris Rodriguez being one of the leading rushers in all the SEC last season. He comes back, he's going to be huge for Kentucky. Of course, I just named two positions. The rushing game is going to be very, very strong this season as they were last season, finishing third in the SEC. The passing game that finished within the bottom four last season for Kentucky and all the SEC, I think gets a lot better this season. Josh Ali is going to be one of the big guys, but a transfer from Nebraska, Wan'Dale Robinson, is going to help Kentucky hugely with offensive explosiveness. I believe a point last season for Kentucky was a big point of struggle, really getting explosiveness, really picking up big plays. And Wan'Dale Robinson, a lot of people don't even classify him as a wide receiver. A lot of people will just say he's an all-purpose player because he can do it all, making plays from the backfield, making plays, catching balls. Wan'Dale Robinson, I think, is a huge addition, and lots of people have agreed the same. I'm pretty sure, I was just looking on Instagram, 24/7 Sports ranked him the #1 transfer in all of college football, or someone did this season, which I think the #1 is questionable for me. I look at guys like obviously Henry To'oTo'o, I think is big. I think Eric Gray is absolutely huge. Those guys transferring, you look at like Tyreek Smith from Georgia or going to Georgia, like guys like that, Darian Kendrick, Eric Gilbert. But to have him #1 or someone think that he's #1 in those group of guys, this guy's going to be absolutely huge for this team. I look at the quarterback situation for Kentucky where it really, really hits me and kind of just gets me worried about this team because you obviously lose Terry Wilson, who was your guy for multiple seasons, and he did very, 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 very well at Kentucky for his seasons while he was there. And now you're left with Bo Allen, Joey Gatewood, and Will Levis, obviously the transfer from Penn State. Am I going to be able to pick any of these guys to be really successful at Kentucky, especially the passing offense, who last season finished dead last in the SEC in passing? It's going to be tough. I think that these guys, in my SEC quarterback rankings, I ranked the Kentucky quarterback room dead last, and that's just where I'm at with this team. That is where I am having this team, who otherwise in every other position is really, really strong, still sitting at 4 in the SEC East. I think they play probably their biggest game in determining their ranking in the SEC East week 2 against Missouri. They get Missouri at home, which is going to be a big game. Another very interesting game that I want to touch on for Kentucky is when LSU travels home there. I think this team built around the quarterback is very, very good, but my question marks for Kentucky are not going to be able to be answered until I see whoever steps out as quarterback. It's looking like it's going to be Levis now, but there's still some push from Gatewood and Allen and all those guys. None of my questions about this Kentucky offense are going to be answered until I'm able to see confidence and what do you want to call it? Confidence and consistency within this Kentucky quarterback position. So for that reason, I am putting them as my #4 team in the SEC East. Coming in at my #4 spot in the SEC West, I have the Ole Miss Rebels. Now, I could be repetitive, and I could say the same thing that everyone else is saying about this team, that the offense is good, and I'm just going to give the quickest rundown possible. Matt Corral, Jerron Ely, Dontario Drummond, Jonathan Mingo, Braylon Sanders equals a good offense. I mean, this team finished #1 in the SEC in total offense, #3 in scoring. This team finished 14th nationally in scoring last season, almost put up at 40 points a game, which we know this Ole Miss offense is on a really, really, really good path to being one of the best in college football this season. The question mark is, as the question mark was last season, defense. Defense for this Ole Miss team, which finished towards the bottom, if not last in the SEC in all the following categories, being scoring defense, total off defense, passing defense, and rushing defense. This team was not very good defensively, and that's going to be the big question mark this season, because we all know if Ole Miss can put together anything comparable defensively, this could be a team pushing for a playoff spot. I know it sounds absurd because it's still like, can this Ole Miss team compete with Alabama? Yes, they had a very good game last season, but are they going to be able to do the same thing this year? Are they going to be able to compete with LSU? Are they going to be able to compete with Texas A&M? All these different forces. How is Lane Kiffin going to do in his second season at Ole Miss? I'm really, really excited for this Ole Miss team. Why I have them at 4 is just that defense and why I have them picking them under these teams. Like, basically, you have Alabama, Texas A&M, LSU. Why am I picking Ole Miss at 4 instead of putting the Ole Miss above LSU, who had a tough season last year, putting them above Texas A&M, who is in a quarterback change, and you had the best quarterback in all the SEC, in my opinion, at Ole Miss? It's just that defense, man. There's nothing else to be said about that defense. You can put up as many points as you want, but there comes a time when you need to make a stop. When your offense isn't going to go 100% each and every single game on each and every single drive, it's just not going to happen. There is going to be a point in time in some given game that your defense is going to be able to, has to be able to make a stop. And you kind of saw that in that Alabama game. Let's say Ole Miss's defense was able to make a stop late in that Alabama game, make 1 or 2 stops in that Alabama game. We could see a completely different outcome of that game than we saw, obviously, what happened, where Alabama pulled away and they ended up winning the game like 63-48 or something. You know, if you watch that game, it was obviously closer. But this Ole Miss offense and this Ole Miss defense is just a tale of two stories, and that's why I have Ole Miss as my number 4 team. But I will tell you this: I like how this Ole Miss schedule plays out in terms of the turnaround games, or the next step games, or the next level games, if that's what you want to call it. Games where you're trying to surpass the teams in front of you. Obviously, those games are going to be Alabama, which I still think Alabama's going to be a bit out of reach this season for Ole Miss, so let's scratch that game. But I'm really focusing in on and zeroing in on LSU and Texas A&M this season. You didn't get Texas A&M last season, but you did get LSU, and LSU was able to come out with the win. If you want to take a next step as Ole Miss for next season, you got to beat either Texas A&M and LSU. And lucky for Ole Miss, they get both of those games at home. So definitely look out for that this season at Ole Miss. Those 2 games are going to be absolutely huge for both teams playing in those games, because Texas A&M, we know, could be going for a division championship. LSU could also be doing the same thing. Ole Miss is basically just trying to climb up the rungs until the point where we're like, okay, Ole Miss is seriously making a run for the SEC West this season. So overall, the defense just has to get better. The defense isn't in any point where I can feel confident about them making a stop against Alabama late in the fourth quarter, making a stop against a Texas A&M or an LSU late in a fourth quarter in a close ball game to be able to win. So that's why I have Ole Miss as my number 4 team in the SEC West. My number 3 team in the SEC East is the Missouri Tigers. Now, I believe that this team, coming into Eli Drinkwitz's second season, has a decent shot of getting that second spot in the SEC East. Right now, I still think that they're a season away. If you get a third-year Connor Bazelak, obviously going into next season, you still return some of the guys that you have this season, some of your returning talent. I think that Missouri could make a case for running for that second spot in the SEC East, or maybe even running for that first spot. But for now, I have them at number 3. I feel pretty confident about this offense, way more confident than a lot of people do. Obviously, this team was only able to put up about 26 points last season per game, but they did finish in the best half in all the SEC. Obviously, co-freshman of the year, Connor Bazelak, returns as starting quarterback for Mizzou, and I think he gets a lot of good receivers back. Obviously, you look at Kiki Chisholm, a guy that you're not going to talk about, or a guy that you're not going to hear if you're just an average SEC fan. Mookie Cooper, transfer from Ohio State, is now coming to the Missouri Tigers. Didn't see much of him at Ohio State, but he is very, very talented. Excited to see what he can do with Bazelak this season. And you're also looking at Dove at this receiving core. You're looking at the rushing game for Missouri this season. First of all, they've returned 4 of 5 starters on that O-line. And in the running back room, you do lose Larry Roundtree, who was close to touching 1,000 yards last season. But even though you lose him, who was your big guy for so many seasons and had a very successful career at Mizzou, you're still going to have Tyler Beatty back there, which I think he is going to be massive this season, a lot better. Even though he rushed for only around 250 yards last season, he is going to have much, much, much more success now being the lead guy at Missouri, because we saw what Roundtree could do at Missouri when you have a good O-line and everything, and you are the guy. It's just Beatty's turn to go up and be that guy for Missouri this season. So lots to look forward to. Definitely offensively for Missouri, I think that they're going to be very solid this season. Defensively, I think they're going to be good. You lose guys like Nick Bolton, obviously, is going to be your big linebacker. But you look at how this team did as a whole last season. They finished 5th in the SEC in passing. You had them finish 7th in rushing. They did give up around 32 points per game last season, which obviously has got to be tuned up a bit more, but you get this Missouri team in good positions, especially in the SEC East. This team does get Texas A&M at home, which is going to be a tough game for them. But I think, again, I mentioned this when I was talking about Kentucky, The big game is going to be week 2 against Kentucky. Now they have to travel to Kentucky. I still feel very, very, very confident about this team going to Kentucky and coming out with a win there, but it should be an amazing game. And even them getting a team like Florida at home. Again, I said that I still think Missouri's a season away from really competing with Florida, but who knows? I picked out that game for being one of my top games in all the SEC this season. Still feeling very, very good about Mizzou this season. I think their team just getting started. Obviously, Drinkwitz is coming into his second season in the SEC. Had a very successful first season. It's time to take it to the next level with your young offense and your young, talented quarterback. See how Mizzou does this season. And I think you could get a win. Even if you don't beat Georgia, if you play a competitive game against them this season, I think Mizzou comes out looking very, very, very good going into 2022. My number 3 team in the SEC West is the LSU Tigers. Now, LSU was a team that, in my mind, made a really, really, really good bid to be put at number 2 or even number 1. I'm not saying that I put tons of thought into number 1, but it did cross my mind in saying that, look at the talent on this LSU team, man. Look at the talent on both sides of the ball. They could come out with the number 1 spot in the SEC West. And as much as you look at the talent and all the guys that they got in this team and all this kind of stuff, you just look at last season and it makes it so hard with just how bad the culture was, how bad the coaching was, all that kind of stuff with LSU last season. Even though the turnover was really bad from the national championship season over to 2020, it was still really, really, really hard to watch that LSU team go out and perform how they did with the talent that they had. And you go into this season, obviously you're going to be looking or being obviously more optimistic if you're an LSU fan, getting a full off season with this team. You're not just going into one of these COVID seasons where you just got to kind of throw things together at the last minute and got to go out and play against Mississippi State in the CBS 330 game and go out and get passed on quite a bit in that game. But I look at this team's bringing in obviously new coordinators. Obviously, you're going to be looking at Durante Jones being the huge DC, hopefully to come in and bring back LSU defense, because Bo Pelini obviously did not do the job last season, as LSU was towards the bottom in the SEC and definitely passing towards the bottom in all of college football. Like, this team finished 127th nationally in the passing game last season, against the pass, that is, in defense terms. So, and you look at the defensive guys that they had in the secondary. You had like Derek Stingley, even though he was dealing with injury and missing out some games. You had guys like Elias Ricks out there. You had guys like Todd Harris. So much talent on the secondary, and for them to finish 127th nationally, you just know something's up and moves needed to be changed. So Durante Jones comes in and looks to be that guy this season. I look at LSU's defense this season. I just talked about the secondary. This secondary easily could be one of the best in the SEC, if not all of the nation. A lot of people say that this is a top 3 secondary in all of college football this season. I look at the D-line. You look at guys like Logan. You look at guys like Gay. I think that they're huge guys on this D-line to go out and have a huge successful season this year. Linebacking room, I look at a guy like Bakersville. First of all, this defense last season did not perform well, but you look at the talent that you have on this defense. Again, I kind of talked about this with Arkansas, where having a full season, a full off season, working with your guys, working with your talented guys, I think will do a lot for Arkansas, and I think it will also do for LSU. So I think LSU defensively is definitely where you're going to see a huge step taken forward, at least hopefully, because I want to see LSU getting back to being competitive, seeing them drop off last season. As much as you might have loved it as an Alabama fan or an LSU fan or a Texas A&M fan, for me, as kind of a outside of the Gamecocks, I'm more of a just neutral SEC fan. I just like seeing the teams that provide crazy atmospheres and good games, like in LSU when they go out and play Alabama when they're competitive. I like seeing those teams being good. So when they do go and play Alabama, we get a good game. Now, talking about this team offensively, Miles Brennan and Max Johnson are obviously going to duke it out for the quarterback position. I think whoever you put in there is going to be fine. They both proved last season that they are going to be great at the position and going to throw the ball around a lot and get the yards needed to be successful for LSU. I don't think the quarterback situation's a problem at all. I don't think wide receivers is a position need at all, as you have not only one of the best in all the SEC, but a lot of people think one of the best in all of football, Kayshon Boutte, coming back for another season. Obviously, LSU's leading receiver in terms of yardage last season. Obviously, Terrace Marshall did out-receive him in receptions last season, but Marshall has now gone on to the Carolina Panthers, and we have Booty being the number one guy for LSU coming into this season. So he should be huge. You look at a guy like DeRay Jenkins, should also be huge. The running game for LSU last season was a bit of a point of concern. Obviously, you lose Clyde Edwards-Helaire. You go with like Davis Price is obviously a big guy back there. You go with other guys back there. You look at Emery, another big guy back there. They finished 12th in the SEC. You're going to have a much bigger running attack if you want to be successful in the SEC this season and finish in the top 3 in the SEC West, because even though I put them in the top 3 of the SEC West, they are as capable of moving up from the number 3 spot as they are capable of moving down from the number 3 spot. This is one of the most bipolar teams that we see in all of college football this season. A team that we have no clue what to expect from. The biggest surprise of a team that we're going to see in all the SEC this season in terms of, is this team going to get back to where they were in 2019, or are they just going to stay right where they were at from 2020? Lots of surprises to be put around for LSU. I look at them and how their schedule shakes out and everything. You get out Texas A&M at home, which is huge. I think you get Auburn at home, which is also big. You obviously go to Alabama, which isn't going to be fun. It's going to be a tough environment, but let's not forget 2019. You did come out of that game with a win. I think Alabama's a bit of a stretch this season. I think Texas A&M, and I think Auburn, and I think Ole Miss, and I think all these teams, Florida, are definitely on the table. But I think the huge reason why I have LSU, at number 3 instead of number 2 is the prevention of the slip-up game, because I think the slip-up game is going to come at LSU at some point. It's going to be a game that you're not expecting, a game that definitely I have circled. Again, I talked about this a bit with Kentucky, but when you travel to Kentucky, that's a game that you're supposed to win. Is LSU going to be able to go perfect in these games that they're supposed to win? I look at a game like UCLA, first game of the season. Are they going to be able to go to Pasadena and come out with a win in that game? Obviously, that means nothing to the SEC schedule. But another game, Ole Miss. Right now, I think Ole Miss is a team that LSU should beat, but they could easily slip up in that game. Even Mississippi State, you travel to Starkville in that game. Traveling to Starkville, no matter what team you have out there, it's not going to be an easy task. We know teams have struggled in Starkville before. Are you going to be able to prevent the slip up in those games? So I have this team slipping up in one game this season. That's what makes predictions hard, because you know that this LSU team is supposed to beat all of those teams. They have the better talent. They have all the better roster and everything like that. They're supposed to beat that team, but you just know at some point in time this season, as they show usually with every season, when you have a team like this, a team that you can't call if they're going to be super good this season or super terrible like they were last season, they're going to have some form of a slip-up game. So that is why I have LSU at my number 3 spot as opposed to my number 2 or 1. I just don't know if they can avoid that one game that they're supposed to win, but they're going to end up losing once you check back the scores on whatever given Saturday. My number 2 team in the SEC East is the Florida Gators. Now, Florida was the team that I picked to win the SEC East last season and go on to face Alabama in the SEC championship, and that's exactly what happened. So I knew Florida was going to be a good team last year. Obviously, you're losing a lot of a talent, especially offensively, of what made that team so great last season. You lose Kyle Trask, you lose Kyle Pitts, you lose Grimes, you lose Tony. I'm sure Florida fans are sick of hearing who they've lost last season, because they've already moved on to the Emory Jones era, and they are excited about the Emory Jones era because he has showed a lot of promise from what we've seen so far from Emory Jones. We know that he could maybe step in and be just as good as Kyle Trask this season for Florida. Now, Florida, even though they lose all those guys, the receivers that I just named, and Florida fans are probably going to kill me if I mention those guys one more time, the receivers that they do bring in are still really, really, really good. Jacob Copeland is probably going to be wide receiver 1 in my opinion. You look at other guys, you look at the tight end position. I look at guys like Gamble, and I look at guys like Zippier being huge there. You look at Xavier Henderson. You look at all these other guys that they have, Justin Shorter. Florida is very, very, very talented still on the receiver corps, even though you look at the guys that they lost last year and you're just like, oh my gosh, how is Florida going to be able to do anything this year without those guys? That was all their production last year. Florida recruits, and Florida always recruits big, and they're always going to have talent back there. Now, the running back room they didn't rush all that much last season. The running game wasn't anything explosive, anything that you're going to write home about, but I expect that to get a lot better this season. Obviously, you still have guys like Malik Davis, you still have guys like Pierce, and you're bringing in a transfer from Clemson, DeMarcus Bowman, former 5-star, he's coming in, so I think the rushing game should get a lot better for this Florida team coming into next season. Defensively, I look at this Florida team, and despite some losses, I still see lots of talent on this team. You look at guys like Brenton Cox at linebacker, you look at Zachary Carter on the D-line, you look at Kiri Elam in the secondary being one of the better cornerbacks in all the country this season. Florida, I think, is going to get a lot better defensively this season. A team that you don't look at, especially after last season, as being any good defensively. I think they're going to get a lot better this season. So why do I have Florida lower than the number 1 team? I don't want to say the number 1 team because I just feel like it is in bad taste for me doing these videos, doing prediction videos, saying the number 1 team before I actually talk about them, even though you guys all know what the number 1 team is. I'm still not going to say it. Why do I have this team under the number 1 team? The number 1 team is in a really, really, really good spot this season. And I think Florida is in a very, very, very similar position that LSU is in terms of, if you talk about the 2 teams, if you ask me who the 2 teams are in each division, pick one in each division, who are the hardest to tell this season, I definitely pick LSU and Florida. LSU and Florida are the most unpredictable teams this season. I could see Florida doing as well as winning this division, and I could also see Florida doing as bad as finishing like 4th in the SEC East, because you still have to compete with Missouri, you still have to compete with Kentucky, which are 2 teams that honestly could compete with this Florida team. Even though I think Florida out-talents them, any given Saturday that those teams are just on it, I think Florida could lose either of those games. But again, is Florida going to be able to get past that slip-up game that I was kind of talking about LSU? You look at games like Missouri, Kentucky, I already talked about them. The LSU game, they have to travel into Death Valley. That's going to be a really, really, really tough game for them. They have to play Georgia still this season. You have Alabama coming to the Swamp, which is not going to be an easy game. The schedule isn't very kind to Florida this season. They have a lot of tough opponents, so they are going to have their work cut out for them, and for those reasons, and just the talent level of the other team above them right now, I feel like Florida had the talent advantage on this team last season, and they did, but now it's shifted back to the other team. So for those reasons, I have the Florida Gators as my number 2 team in the SEC East. Coming in at my number 2 spot in the SEC West, I have the Texas A&M Aggies. Now, this could be the season that one does get dethroned. Even though they got dethroned in 2019, it just seemed like in 2020, this team picked up right where they left off in 2018. Coming in at my number 2 spot in the SEC West, I have the Texas A&M Aggies. Now, is this the season where they dethrone the Dynasty X? Because I'm not going to say the team, even though you all know what team I'm talking about. For the purpose of doing these prediction videos, I do not name the number 1 team until I start talking about them. But that is basically the whole question. I think this Texas A&M team is talented galore to go out and win as many games as they'd like in the SEC, as many games they'd like in the non-conference games. It all comes down to that one game against Dynasty X that I'm just like, is this team ready or not to go and play that team? And I just released my preview for that game. Great preview. Definitely go check that out. Great detailed, long preview if you want to go check that out. But talking about Texas A&M this season and why they're going to be so successful. Defensively, first of all, one of the better defenses in all the SEC last season, finishing number 1 in total defense, finishing like 2-3 in the top 3 in all the other categories, whether it being scoring defense, passing defense, rushing defense. People don't talk about this defense enough. It is amazing. It is one of the best in all the SEC. People just don't talk about it. So you look at the D-line, you're obviously going to be looking at guys like Peavy. DeMarvin Leal's going to have a huge season this year. The linebackers are going to be amazing. The secondary is going to be amazing. Enough of me listing players because I've been doing it all video. You guys just want to know what's going to make this team good, and especially offensively, because scoring is a huge part of what's going to help you beat Dynasty X. And not only being able to stop the ball with that defense who did let up 52 points to Dynasty X last season. We talk about this offense who only scored 24 points. What is going to happen for this team to really boost that scoring margin and get some points up on the board when they get this team at home? The big questions for me isn't at the O-line. That's a lie. The O-line is a bit of a question mark for me this season. They lose a couple guys on the O-line, which was one of the most successful in all the SEC last season. Obviously, that's going to have to do some work. Definitely not at the running back position because I've said it. I think they had their best running back room in all the SEC. maybe in all the country. Like, I honestly think that Texas A&M's running back room is that good. They have no problem with the receivers. You still got guys like Lane. You got guys like DMAS. You got guys like Anais Smith, who I classify still as a running back, but it looks like he's playing full-time wide receiver this season, basically an all-purpose back. Let's call him an athlete. Because that's what he is. Question for me is at quarterback, and I talked a lot about this. If you watch that SEC, or if you watch that Alabama Texas A&M preview that I just put out, my question marks were with Haynes King, the guy that they have coming in at quarterback. Obviously, this is going to be his first season of starting for Texas A&M. Will you have a guy who's being thrown into the role go out and finish the season absolutely flawless? Because that's what's holding Texas A&M from being the number one team in this division. Is, are they going to be able to go flawless? Are they going to be able to go up and compete against Dynasty X this season? Look, I think this team can beat LSU, even though they have to go to LSU, even though LSU still has a good chance against anyone of being Texas A&M this season. I still think that's a game that Texas A&M with this talented roster should win. Texas A&M should beat Ole Miss. Texas A&M should beat Mississippi State. Texas A&M should beat South Carolina. Texas A&M should beat Missouri. Texas A&M should beat Arkansas. They should beat Auburn. They should beat every single team in the SEC West except that one Dynasty X team. First of all, do they get through the season without the slip-up that I talked about with Florida and I talked about with LSU? I feel more confident in this roster, in this current roster. I just really like the defense on this team, almost better than both of those teams, and the offense still is very well-rounded, even though the quarterback position is still a question mark for me until I see. It's not a question mark in the sense that, is this guy going to be one of the worst in all the SEC? It's more of a question mark of, is this guy going to be of the elite status to get them to that number one spot? And that's where my confidence level is weary of me putting this Texas A&M team at number one in all of the division, because that team above them, even though they're throwing in a guy who is also going to be playing in his first season. I hate saying that because I'm always so critical on guys bringing in their first team or their Haynes King guy into the season. He's playing his first full season, but then I go and talk about the other team who has a guy starting his first full season, hasn't played any meaningful snaps, and I talk about him as high as the moon. Well, that's because that guy is 20th all-time in the all-time recruits, and Haynes King is at like 130 in his own class. I feel like there's a bit of advantage there for that team that is at number one with their quarterback in their recruiting class, because that guy was very, very, very highly recruited. And Haynes King, even though he was the sixth dual threat quarterback out of his class, he's still got lots to prove to me. So for those reasons, I am putting Texas A&M at my number two team. Could see a very competitive game against them with my number one team, because they do get that team at home. It's going to be an amazing game. But other than that, that's my only loss that I see for Texas A&M. This team, regardless if they win or lose that game, is going to have a very, very successful season. All right, let's kick off my number one team, shall we? Coming up in my number one spot in the SEC East, obviously another name. I wouldn't mention the name in the Florida, talking about Florida, but we have the Georgia Bulldogs. I have no problem in saying this, coming out here and saying this, because even though sometimes I get my predictions wrong, like I go out, I said that Florida was still going to beat Oklahoma in that Cotton Bowl last season, and they got kicked. I didn't make any excuses for me saying that or anything. I put my hand up and say that was my bad. So it's not like I have any problems with people coming at me or anything like that if I make a wrong statement or anything like that. But when I do make statements, I do mean them, and I mean them wholeheartedly, that I feel like this Georgia Bulldogs team, as much as I hate saying it, because I do bleed garden and black. You see you see the shirt on me, you see the jersey behind me. This Georgia Bulldogs team is national championship ready. The talent on this team is ready. Everything on this team is ready to go and do something dangerous this season. Now that means I of course have to put them as my number one team in the SEC East, regardless of what happened last season. Yes, they lose to Florida. They're not able to win the East. So be it. I think this team is coming back, and they're coming back recharged with a purpose and a mission this season to not only win the SEC East, to not only win the SEC championship, but get back to the playoff and do some damage in the playoffs. So let's talk about this offense, because the offense is going to be the key decider. Georgia has a good defense each and every single season. I don't think that that's going to change this season. You look at the D-line, it's going to be one of the best in all the nation, obviously, with Davis and Wyatt. I had them only compared to with like Alabama and Clemson for the best in the nation. The secondary is still going to be good. Obviously, they hit the transfer portal really good and grabbed Kendrick from Clemson. And the linebackers are going to be good. Defense isn't a concern for Georgia. Hasn't been a concern for some time. It is more about, is this offense able to produce enough to go up against your teams like Alabama, to go up against your teams like Clemson, to go up against your teams like Oklahoma, stuff like that. Will this offense be able to produce enough to be able to do some damage this season? You have your returning starter coming back from last season. Obviously, JT Daniels is coming back. Georgia fans have been shouting it out from the rooftops that he is Georgia's guy and he is going to bring them towards an SEC East title. Not only that, but a national championship. Georgia fans and really the whole college football world feels really, really, really good about JT Daniels going into this season, calling him one of the best in all of college football this season, being a Heisman favorite, all these things. JT Daniels has the expectations on him. He has the pressure on him, but will he be able to go up and face it? I think JT Daniels is going to go out and have a huge season, and lucky for him, he has the weapons around him, because I talk about the other teams who have the weapons around their quarterback. It's just, do they have the quarterback in there? I feel like Georgia's that team who has the weapons around their quarterback and they have the right guy in there for the job. You look at running backs, you look at guys like obviously Zamir White, you look at guys like James Cook, you look at guys like Kendall Milton, you look at guys like McIntosh. This running back room is absolutely loaded. Wide receivers, no different. Obviously, you're going to have your like Jermaine Burton's. Obviously, George Pickens is hurt, which sucks, but you're going to have other guys step up like Mitchell. You're going to have other guys step up like Blaylock. You're going to have Keiris Jackson. All of these other guys for Georgia on the receiving core is going to be huge. And of course, you go out and land the best tight end recruit we've probably ever seen in Eric Gilbert in the transfer portal. Match him up with Darnell Washington, who is also a huge 5-star recruit. And this offense is in business, not to mention the O-line is going to be just fine. There's no complaints there. This offense is going to be just fine to the point where they are going to be towards the top of not only the SEC, but I believe in college football in scoring if JT Daniels is able to produce. And I wouldn't say it's a big if, as like I'd say with like Bo Nix at Auburn or other guys around the SEC that I'm talking about. If this quarterback can perform, this team's offense will be good this season. I have confidence that JT Daniels will be able to perform this season. So what's really stopping Georgia from being a national champion this season? You get Clemson first game. That's going to be interesting. What's going to hold Georgia from the college football playoff? You're probably going to have to play Alabama in the SEC championship if you do make it to that point. But for now, Georgia's just goal is to win the SEC East and probably get there undefeated so they're in a position. Obviously, that Clemson game is going to mean a lot, the first game of the season. But it would be nice if they could get to the SEC championship as an undefeated team, where hopefully you're in a position where win that game, lose that game, you're still going to the college football playoff. So Georgia, I have the winning the SEC East this year, and I have them winning by a sizable margin. I don't think Florida's at a point, even though they beat them last season, I still think Georgia is a step ahead of Florida this season. I think they're a step ahead Mizzou. I think they're a step ahead everyone that they play this season. So Georgia, give me number one in the SEC East. Coming up at my number one spot in the SEC West, that is right, we have reached number one in the SEC West. I have Dynasty X, the Alabama Crimson Tide. Now, as good as I feel about Texas A&M and as good as I talked about them just prior a couple of minutes ago or tens of minutes ago, however long it was, when I talked about Texas A&M in this video, Alabama, as long as they have the GOAT, as long as they have Nick Saban roaming the sidelines and working recruiting and bringing in all these big-name guys to Alabama will always be atop of the SEC West. It's just the way that it's going to be. Naming the roster for you guys, something that I've done with all the other teams, is basically pointless for me at this point, because you guys know all the brand name guys. You guys know all the guys on Alabama's roster because they are talked about so much because of how talented they are and how good they are going to be this season. Bryce Young hasn't even played a meaningful snap at Alabama, and he's already talked about as a Heisman favorite, as one of the best in all of college football at the quarterback position. John Mechie being one of the best at wide receiver. Brian Robinson's supposed to have a big season. Defensively, you got Josh Jobe, Jordan Battle, Will Anderson, Christian Harris, Jalen Moody, Henry To'oTo'o. You got so many guys that you could just name down as being big brand name guys in college football, that it just seems unstoppable. It just seems unfair that Alabama, even though they go over the roster turnover this season, you lose Devontae Smith, Heisman winner. You lose Mac Jones. You lose Jalen Waddle. You lose Christian Barmore. You lose Alex Leatherwood. You lose Landon Dickerson. You lose all of these guys. I didn't even say Najee Harris. You lose all these guys on Alabama, and it just seems unfair that the next season you're bringing up guys like Ajayi Hall, like your Ja'Cory Brooks, like all these guys, JaQuincy McKinstry or Kool-Aid McKinstry, just these young, talented guys that are just going to turn into the next guys that came before them. And Alabama's still going to be looking at being the number one team or at least a top two team this season in all of college football, in my opinion. Right now, I have them and Oklahoma being the 1-2 team in all of college football in my preseason rankings. But what else can we say about this team? They have to travel to Texas A&M. That's obviously going to be the biggest test. That and when LSU comes to town, those are probably their two biggest tests, and traveling to Florida. Florida, I don't know if they're at a point. I've admitted it. I don't think Florida's at a point right now that they're going to be able to compete with Alabama, even though they did last season. Roster turnover in terms of returning and bringing up the talent that you lost and everything like that. I don't think it's at the level that Alabama is at. LSU, you do have to come into Bryant-Denny Stadium, and I said it earlier in the video. We all know LSU won that game last time that they traveled into Bryant-Denny Stadium, but I still think Alabama's in a better spot than LSU is right now. The only game that's somewhat questionable is that Texas A&M game. You have to travel to Aggie Land. Obviously, they have a really stacked team. Just talked about them. But how do you pick this Alabama team to lose in any game? And this isn't me just trying to ride the Alabama bandwagon. I want to see something mixed up in the SEC. It was super fun to watch an LSU team go out and shake up and finally have a team other than Alabama winning out of the SEC, making the playoffs. It was super fun, even as a Gamecocks fan, seeing Georgia go to the playoff and just seeing someone different than Alabama all the time, even though they did play Alabama in that national championship go in. I'd love to see an Auburn make a playoff. I'd love to see like your Ole Miss. I'd love to see Florida make a playoff, even though I don't like them. I'd love to see my South Carolina Gamecocks make a playoff. I want to see some parity in the SEC. It's just impossible, guys. It is absolutely impossible to overlook the talent on this team and who they have coaching this team. They have an ex-NFL coach, no matter how you feel on how good Bill O'Brien was with the Houston Texans. He is now your offensive coordinator. You just have guys all around you who are football guys, who are talented guys, and you have the greatest coach in all football history. Him and Bill Belichick own their own prospective leagues, whether that be the NFL or college football. I'm just going to stop talking about Alabama because a lot of people get sick of hearing how good Alabama is. I get sick of hearing how good Alabama is, but if I'm going to give predictions, you cannot overlook how good this team is. It's as simple as that. It's as simple as that, and I don't even think their offense is the best part about them this year. I think the defense is the best part about them. Watch out for them this season. So that is going to wrap up my predictions, guys. Longest video ever in touchdowns to home runs history, I can tell you that. Lots of talking, lots of hard work and effort put into this. So thank you guys for watching. Of course, hit that like button down below. I'd appreciate it if you subscribed. If you aren't already, and definitely check out for more North to South Show content because we're still leading up to the season. Still lots of great stuff to be talked about. So guys, definitely drop a like, subscribe, comment. Thank you for watching, and definitely come back next time.